Okay, this is where I left off before my iPhone ran out of charge. So the question here is, what would be the appearance of someone who does not produce myostatin? So just to review, myostatin blocks the activation of satellite cells, and satellite cells are important for proper muscle protein synthesis and muscle hypertrophy. So someone that has myostatin that's knocked out, they'll look a lot bigger than normal. So here you have two mice. The mouse on the left here has a myostatin deficiency, and you can see that it is quite a big, scary mouse. This type of bull is called a Belgian blue. It's got a myostatin deficiency, so it's bred that way. And so it's got quite a bit of muscular development. This is just another picture of the same type of animal. So again, it's got a myostatin deficiency. It's bred to be that way. And this is just a picture from behind. Again, you can see the extreme muscular development. These are chickens with myostatin deficiency. Again, they're very muscular chickens. This is how a normal whippet would look. So this is a dog that's, it looks like a miniature greyhound. It's a very fast and lean dog. This is a female whippet with myostatin deficiency. So again, you can see it's got extreme muscle hypertrophy, which is very unusual for this breed of dog. So it looks like a scary dog. It's simply got myostatin deficiency, so it's got unchecked satellite cell activation. There's a kid somewhere in Germany with myostatin deficiency, so this is just a picture from a scientific journal of the muscular development in his legs when he's young. This is a photoshopped image, so this isn't real. And just beware that you'll see some nutritional supplements. You can see how it claims to be a myostatin neutralizer, which couldn't be possible by taking a nutritional supplement. So the claims on this nutritional supplement are probably false. Next topic I'm going to deal with here is strength training adaptations, and I'm specifically going to be talking about muscle hypertrophy versus hyperplasia. So hypertrophy refers to an increase in muscle fiber size. Hyperplasia refers to an increase in number, and there's some controversy about whether hyperplasia occurs with training. Hypertrophy definitely occurs with training. I'll go over the definitions of each and the evidence for and against hyperplasia. So the differences between hyperplasia and hypertrophy, again, hyperplasia is increase in cell number, hypertrophy is increase in cell size, so the cells in this case can refer to muscle fibers. Which one is more likely to occur with resistance training with regards to skeletal muscle fibers? Most likely it's hypertrophy. And which muscle fibers are most likely to respond to resistance training with an increase in size? Those would be your type 2 or fast twitch fibers. They tend to hypertrophy more easily than a slow twitch type 1 muscle fiber. Measuring hypertrophy is quite simple. You can take a muscle biopsy and you can measure the fiber area under a microscope. So this is an example of, I think this was 6 weeks of high intensity strength training. This is just the cross sections of muscle fibers under a microscope. You can see from pre-training to post-training how the muscle fibers are larger in size. So this is an example of muscle fiber hypertrophy. Measuring hyperplasia is a little bit more difficult. You'd have to count the number of muscle fibers, which is something that's difficult to do in a live human. But they have done some studies to show that hyperplasia, so an increase in muscle fiber number, it can occur with strength training in cats, in birds, but not rats. So it seems to be species specific. I'll go into the cat study here for a second. So in this study, the cat was trained to lift a weight, and then they would get a food reward by lifting that weight. And they would only get the food reward if they lifted weight with their one paw. So they had one arm or paw that received the resistance training. The opposite arm or paw did not, leg on the cat, the opposite leg did not receive the resistance training. They then killed the cats. They counted the muscle fibers and found that the muscle fiber number was increased in the leg that did the training versus the leg that did not do the training. With regards to birds, the way they resistance train the birds is they just hang weights from one of their wings, and then they carry around that weight with their wing over weeks, and they get an increase in muscle fiber number in the wing that was weighted, but not the opposite wing. And for rats, you can train rats to, I guess similar to cats, you can train one limb in a rat, or you can train rats to climb a device with a weight on their tail, and that's how they do the resistance training for the rats. Human studies, there are some studies that look at right to left differences, specifically in the legs on autopsy, and they've counted the muscle fibers, and they do find that there's a difference. It looks like the left leg, which is non-dominant in most people, actually has a greater muscle fiber number, probably because if you're doing something like kicking a ball with your right leg, then you're supporting your weight with your left leg. So your left leg is kind of getting the greater strength training in that case. So there is a difference between your left and right legs. The left leg looks like it has a greater muscle fiber number. With resistance training, you'll see appearance in muscle fibers of these developmental myosin heavy chains. So this includes neonatal and embryonic heavy chains that usually only appear early in life when you're getting muscle fibers, new muscle fibers developing. So it's indirect evidence that you're getting new muscle fibers developed. But it could also be that you've damaged muscle fibers with your resistance training, and these developmental myosin heavy chains are simply appearing in a muscle fiber that's repairing itself. And then they have estimation techniques to estimate muscle fiber number in live humans. And I've got an explanation of this technique built into these questions. So using magnetic resonance imaging or computed tomography, you can measure the entire cross-sectional area of a muscle. And then using muscle biopsies, you can measure the cross-sectional area of individual muscle fibers. And the question here is, how can you estimate the number of muscle fibers in an entire muscle? And I'm going to go to the whiteboard quickly to explain how this might be done. So you get a computed tomography scan. Say this would be a muscle. This would be like a whole muscle. And the scan would allow you to assess this cross-sectional area of a muscle. So this would be a CT scan or MRI. You get the whole muscle fiber area. Within the muscle, you can take muscle biopsies. So you can take like a piece of muscle out, and then within that piece of muscle, you can assess the average fiber area of your muscle fibers. And then you can take this average fiber area, so this is your average muscle fiber area, so cross-sectional area, so that would be your cross-sectional area there. You can take your average muscle fiber cross-sectional area and divide it into the area of the whole muscle. So you get whole muscle area. This would be your cross-sectional area divided by your average muscle fiber area. That's from the biopsy. And this is how they've attempted to estimate muscle fiber number in live humans. So there's a couple of studies using that estimation technique. In the first study, they compared bodybuilders to non-bodybuilders, and they found that there were no differences between the two groups with regards to estimated muscle fiber number. So the larger muscles in the bodybuilders was strictly due to larger muscle fibers, so to hypertrophy. And then they did a training program, I think it was around 8 weeks, where they estimated, actually it was a few months, so it was probably more like 16 weeks. They estimated muscle fiber number before and after resistance training. And again, they found that the increase in muscle size was because of hypertrophy and not because of hyperplasia. So most likely in humans, you get an increase in muscle size because of hypertrophy and not hyperplasia. Now I'm going to switch gears here. I'm going to talk about some endurance training adaptations because protein synthesis is also important for endurance training. So the question here is, which of the following would least likely increase with aerobic endurance training? The correct answer here would be your muscle fiber area. So capillarization, either assessed as the number of capillaries serving muscle fibers, so that would be your capillary to fiber ratio, or your capillary density, so the number of capillaries serving an entire fiber area. Both of those would be increased with aerobic training, which would increase your oxygen delivery to your muscles. And your mitochondria would increase in your muscle fibers, and you know that that allows you to generate energy aerobically. Your muscle fiber area would most likely not increase or stay the same. There are some exceptions. I can think of a sport like cycling. If you go from an untrained state and you become a well-trained cyclist, then you do get some hypertrophy of your quadriceps muscle. But in most cases, endurance training, aerobic endurance training has minimal effects on muscle fiber area. Which of the enzymes of which of the following pathways would not increase with aerobic training? The correct answer here would be glycolysis. So this is the only metabolic pathway of these four that's located outside of the mitochondria. So all the other pathways would be enhanced with aerobic endurance training. Now, how are the following linked to oxygen transport? So I've got a number of components that are important for aerobic performance. So you've got your mitochondria, capillaries, myoglobin, hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is a protein that carries oxygen in the blood. And then myoglobin is, we covered this earlier in the class, it gives your muscle that red appearance. Myoglobin carries oxygen in the muscle. So I've got kind of an outline of how these different structures interact in this slide. So this slide goes over the effects of increased capillarization that you get with endurance training. So I'm going to fill this in. As capillaries increase in, here's your possible answers down here. So as capillaries increase in number, what that does is it actually slows down the velocity of blood flowing past the muscle. So if you had very small number of capillaries, you'd shoot a large volume of blood through, say, 1 or 2 capillaries, it's going to go very fast. Whereas if you have multiple capillaries that serve a muscle and you have the same volume of blood that's going through there, it's going to travel more slowly past the muscle. And the advantage of that is it allows greater diffusion of oxygen from hemoglobin that's in the blood. So hemoglobin is that protein that carries oxygen in the blood, and the oxygen has to diffuse from hemoglobin, which is carried in the capillaries, into the muscle fiber. So in the muscle fiber, oxygen is carried by myoglobin. So it's another protein that transports oxygen, and the myoglobin would take the oxygen to the mitochondria. And you know by now that in the mitochondria, oxygen is used in the electron transport chain, and in that electron transport chain, you get production of ATP. So those are the answers to that last exercise. Okay, combining strength training with aerobic endurance training. Are the two types of training compatible with each other? There's a lot of controversy in this area, and it's very important for certain athletes. So there's quite a few studies that show that strength training will interfere with your endurance training adaptations and vice versa. So aerobic training would interfere with your strength training adaptations. So it's a challenge for some athletes. So for some athletes, it doesn't really matter too much. So something like a marathon runner, you can see that they're characterized by the very lean. So they don't have huge muscles. And that probably gives them an advantage because they have to carry their body weight over long distances. But having a smaller, leaner muscle also allows greater ability for oxygen to diffuse into their muscle fibers and get to the mitochondria. So having a smaller muscle with a greater amount of mitochondria, greater capillarization, just makes it easier for oxygen to diffuse into the muscle fiber and get to the mitochondria. On the other hand, someone that's involved in something like the shot put exercise, they don't require a great aerobic capacity, so they're just relying on pure strength. And you can see a shot putter is characterized by being very big and very muscular. So if this individual tried to run a marathon, they might have greater difficulty because they're carrying greater body mass, but their muscles also require greater diffusion distances for oxygen to get inside their big muscle fibers and then get to the mitochondria. So there could be a challenge with that regard too. This is a picture of Dylan Armstrong. He initially came in 4th place at the Beijing Olympics. And then 2 or 3 years later, he was awarded the bronze medal. So he missed all the glory at the Olympic Games, but 2 or 3 years later, he was awarded the bronze medal after one of the medalists' post-game blood samples ended up being showing up with a positive drug test. Now, those are sports that involve either strength or just aerobic capacity. Now, in some sports, it's a challenge because you have to have both high strength and high aerobic capacity. So this is an example of rugby, of a sport that involves both strength and aerobic capacity. So this is rugby. You have to be fairly strong to be able to tackle players and to be able to push players around, say in a scrum or in a ruck or maul. You see the players pushing on each other. But they have to run. The games last 80 minutes and a good portion of the game is spent running. And so you get a big guy like this one here. This is a fellow from Saskatoon. His name is Hubert Bidens. So he is a prop for Team Canada. And you can see that he is a large size, but with that sport, he also has to have a pretty good aerobic capacity. And I've got a quick clip here, a YouTube clip of rugby in action here. So this just gives you a demonstration of the amount of running that's involved.
Oh, she's in difficulty there on the right-hand side of the French scrum, isn't she? In France, well, they've coughed up possession there as Canada look to bring it away through a Marchak looking for Harvey. Harvey's away over the 22, giving chases Miles. Harvey inside Ledouf, launches away. Magali Harvey, can she go all the way in at the corner? Canada goal! What a fantastic try!
Well, she picks it out of the scrum, and then it's Ellery. She does well, and then it's the handling under pressure here. The quick hands, the French alignment. Well, it was thrown to bits. It was in disarray, wasn't it? And then it was down, and it's all about one person, and that person is Magali Harvey. Inside out, the balance, the poise. I love the way she's been shouted to the line by her teammate in support there. I can't see who it was. What a finish. The balance here, inside out. Leduff squared up, taken on the inside. And And then it's this foot race to the line. Great effort coming back there by Liev. She tried everything, but it was all in vain there.
This could well be the try of the tournament for Magali Harvey, shortlisted for Women Player of the Year.
So I think that was actually the try of the year in rugby for 2014. That was at the Women's World Cup, and Canada had won the silver medal at that World Cup. Just to highlight, Kayla Mack from Saskatoon was on that team. Now this shows how strength training might interfere with your aerobic adaptations. So these are muscle fibers from before to after a 12-week strength training program, and they are stained for an enzyme called succinate dehydrogenase. You should know that that enzyme is part of the Krebs cycle, so it's a mitochondrial enzyme, and you can see that the stain is lighter with the bigger fibers after the strength training. So what's happening with the strength training is the muscle fibers are getting larger, and then the mitochondria have to serve a greater fiber area. So the mitochondria are getting more spaced out within the muscle fiber. So that would make it more difficult to get oxygen from the capillaries to your mitochondria if your muscle fibers are larger. So in this case, you might get interference with your aerobic capacity by having larger muscle fibers. How would capillary density, so capillaries serving a given fiber area, change with strength training that resulted in substantial hypertrophy? So if you had substantial hypertrophy without an increase in capillary number, then your capillary density would decrease, and this could affect your aerobic ability of muscle because of reduced oxygen delivery. So capillary density, if you have a muscle fiber, so this is the cross section of the muscle fiber, you have your capillaries, they have to deliver oxygen to the mitochondria in the muscle fibers. If you have a larger muscle fiber, so this is quite an exaggeration, you have the same number of capillaries, that oxygen has to diffuse a greater distance to make it into the muscle fiber. So theoretically, you could have an interference in your aerobic ability of your muscles. A long, intense aerobic training session might require breakdown of muscle protein for gluconeogenesis, so true or false. So this is true. So you know with regards to the glucose-alanine cycle that you get breakdown of protein in the muscle. The amino acid gets broken down to go into the Krebs cycle. Then you get the amine group combining with pyruvate to form alanine, goes to the liver to form glucose in gluconeogenesis. So this is another way that aerobic training might interfere with your strength training adaptations. If you're getting breakdown of protein in your muscle for energy for aerobic performance, then it's going to interfere with your strength training adaptations. What specialized cells are activated with exercise training to increase the number of nuclei in muscle fibers? You know that this is the satellite cells. These satellite cells help to synthesize new protein once they turn into nuclei. For endurance training, that would refer to mitochondrial protein. And for strength training, it's your myofibrillar protein. So your actin, myosin, and probably your troponin and tropomyosin. With strength training and aerobic training, there's competition for protein synthesis between the two types of protein. So that's another way that strength training and aerobic training might interfere with each other. So this is a study where it was shown that doing aerobic training immediately after resistance training reduced the satellite cell activation compared to when doing resistance training alone. So in this case, it's physiological evidence for aerobic training interfering with your strength training adaptations. With too much training, you might get increased production of stress hormones like cortisol, and that's a catabolic hormone. It breaks down protein. So the question here is, if you're doing strength training and resistance training, how can you get over the problem of doing too much training on a single day? The answer is that you could do light aerobic workouts on your strength training day and vice versa. So you can do your light strength training days on your heavy aerobic day. Or another solution is to completely break them up. So this question, this is from a specific study. Which type of training schedule is best for increasing strength, and which is best for increasing muscle aerobic capacity? So performing strength training on Monday and Wednesday and aerobic training on Tuesday and Thursday. So doing the aerobic training and strength training on completely different days. It was best for increasing strength. And then performing aerobic training followed by strength training on the same day was best for increasing muscle aerobic capacity. So depending what you want, if you want to get a little bit of strength gains, but more gains with your aerobic capacity, it's better to combine the two types of training on the same day. If you want to get superior strength gains and less gains for aerobic capacity, it's probably better to do your two types of training on different days. Timing of sessions might be important. So this study found that doing aerobic exercise 6 hours before resistance training actually enhanced translation, reduced myostatin, and increased muscle mass more than doing resistance training alone. So these studies are kind of contradictory. This one combined the aerobic training and resistance training on the same day, but it looked like if they were spaced out enough, they actually had an enhancing effect. So the aerobic training actually enhanced the changes that you'd want to get with strength training. So it might be just the timing that's important. And that is it for today's lecture.